Well, good afternoon, everybody. Since it is now about a minute and a half, let's say, after 2 o'clock Eastern Time, 1 o'clock Chicago time, I think we are good to get started. Hopefully more of us will show up, but if not, we have a nice, good-sized group here for discussion. Uh, so thank you all for attending the ACRL Access Services Interest Group's Fall Forum on the Framework for Access Services Librarianship, Competencies for Access Services Work. Jess, we can go to the Thank you. For those of you unfamiliar, Access Services Interest Group is charged to provide a broad framework for discussing topics and exploring areas of development in the field of access services, including, but not limited to, circulation, information services, reserves, resource sharing, stacks maintenance, student worker supervision, leadership management, remote storage, and security. Through this work, we strive to provide a national stage for library workers and access services and enhance the overall development of access services conversations and programs within ACRL. Our group is headed by 3 pairs of co-conveners who each serve staggered 3-year terms as incoming, current, and past officials. This year's past co-conveners are Tori Lieggi of Lycoming College and Lorelei Sterling of the University of Alaska Anchorage. This year's current co-conveners are Jeff Hipsher at Florida State University Libraries and myself, Andrew Yager, of the University of Maryland University's at Shady Grove campus. This year's incoming co-conveners are Christine Forbes of Shenandoah University and Loftan Hooker of Virginia Commonwealth University. Our fall forum today is devoted to Section 2 of the ACRL Framework for Access Services Librarianship, Competencies for Access Services Librarians and Managers. We appreciate all of you making time to review the framework and participate in this discussion, which will help guide our group's next steps in building upon this foundational document to our profession. We'll provide some guiding questions to help instigate conversation, but please feel free to ask your own questions of the group or share your unique perspective of the framework and its impact on your experiences as an information professional. That would be in chat or verbally when we have a chance. But before we get started, I'll share some basic guidelines we think will help ensure a positive and productive discussion. Please keep your mic muted until you are called on to share. To ask a question verbally, use the raised hand feature in Zoom and we'll call on participants accordingly. In order to ensure equal space for all participants, we kindly ask all speakers keep their shares under 2 minutes. Please feel free to type questions in the chat. The moderators will be sure they are read aloud. If you'd like to ask a question or share your ideas anonymously, message one of our facilitators privately, and they will read your statement aloud on your behalf. In today's session, that would be myself, Loftan, or Lorelei. Please be respectful of all participants. Treat other participants' reflections and questions with respect. Acknowledge that we may be at different stages of learning on the topic. Speak and let others speak. Share responsibility for including all voices in the discussion. If you have a tendency to dominate discussions, take a step back and help the group invite others to speak. If you tend to stay quiet, challenge yourself to share ideas so others can learn from you. And please keep comments on topic. Also, please assume positive intent. We are here to ask genuine, curious questions and provide responses that will help move the libraries toward constructive outcomes. Also, please note that this session is being recorded and will be posted to the ACRL YouTube channel in the future.
Thank you, Andrew, and thank you everyone for being here today. My name is Jeff Hipsher. I'm the head of Access Services and Delivery for Florida State University Libraries, and I'll be facilitating today's conversation. As some of you may know, today's forum serves as the 3rd installment in our series on the framework for Access Services Librarianship. As a document, it aims to help shape, define, and explain the scope of this branch of librarianship in hopes that it'll continue to build upon, expand, and greater define this specialization for the foreseeable future. As such, this document serves a variety of purposes for those specializing in access services, their colleagues across the library, and the national associations tasked with stewarding the intellectual craft of librarianship. This series began last fall with a conversation about the framework as a whole. In spring of 2024, we discussed Section 1 and its attempt to define access services, which brings us to today's forum in Section 2, competencies for access services, librarians, and managers. And so we have these 2 guiding questions for our conversation today. Does this list of competencies provided in section 2 adequately describe and contextualize the labor performed by access services. And there you see a list of the competencies, their general sections, and then in detail, which each section composes when it comes to describe that particular competency. And then a follow-up, kind of a contextualizing question: are these competencies sufficient for hiring, training, or drafting position descriptions for a job in your department? With that, we're going to open it up. We're going to let everyone sit in silence until someone asks a question or gives their answer. And that starts now. Again, if you want to ask a question or provide your response anonymously, please feel free to message one of the moderators privately, and we'll read it aloud for you. We have a hand raised, and we do. I can't see it though. It's showing me that a hand is raised, but it's not showing me who it belongs to.
It is Nadine.
Nadine, feel free.
Thank you. So I just had one question. Are the competencies listed in any particular order?
They're listed in the order as they appear on that slide. So collections and stacks management, then leadership, human resources, safety and security, service, and then last, space as a service.
So is it a randomized list just as it developed, or is there meaning? So the first thing that comes up is collections and stacks management. It would seem to me that other competencies would be more important or rise to, if we were going to put them in order by importance.
There's no, and anyone, please feel free to chime in and correct me, but in my reading of the framework, there's no explanation or logic given for the order in which the competencies appear. I do think you're raising a good point though, because I mean, you are making a suggestion, right? By having them in the order that they are, people, like, everyone is going to read into that. And yeah, I don't know if we're ranking them in order of importance. I don't know that that's the order I would have selected. But it is a good point, something to be mindful of as we think about revisions. What does the order transmit to the reader? I think that's another point too for today's conversation. You know, clearly we're interested in the questions that we've posed. If you have your own questions or your own comments on section 2, we'd love to hear them. But additionally, we're also trying to think of the framework as a document. Maybe the content is correct, but there are there's organization changes that could be made, or you know, formatting changes that can be made in order to make the document more accessible. Kara in the chat pointing out that collections and stack maintenance does not always fall within their access services. I think that's true for a lot of access services departments, and I think what we're each composed of is gonna be different moving from, you know, organization to organization. For instance, interlibrary loan is often a central element to access services. Not here at FSU libraries; they're their own department. So those changes are important to note. Lorelei and then Eric.
I don't know if anyone's following the Circ Plus listserv, but there was a really good question on there about where does stacks maintenance live at your library? And she just, the original questioner asked, gave some stats today. So of the 110 responses, 93 of them were that stacks maintenance was in access services. So I think that's a really interesting, that is quite a few that aren't, but the wild majority was in access services. Just anecdotally, that was in the listserv today.
Yeah, it makes sense that it would be that common. Absolutely. Here at FSU Libraries, up until 30, 40 years ago, stacks maintenance was not part of our actual access services department. But soon, Eric Love, who has his hand raised, joined our department, and my life has been that much easier ever since. Eric.
Yeah, I just kind of wanted to comment on what you've got listed under there, the ongoing collection maintenance, shifting projects, data gathering, long-term planning. I think one of the things that might be missing, and maybe it is just unique to FSU, but I doubt it, is the relationship that stacks maintenance, and this is where we sort of used to live before we joined access services, was with our technical services department, because we work a lot. I think there should be something in there about working with the cataloging department, because we work heavily on things like lost books, missing books, cataloging issues, things like that are constantly coming up and being, so it's sort of an interdepartmental outreach thing that happens with specifically with cataloging. And I assume that happens in all of the collections maintenance, but it isn't listed.
Eric, that's a good point. I don't think I noticed that, to be honest, before. That cataloging wasn't broken out as a... So if you're looking at the framework, if you have it in front of you, each of the bolded titles there, it's like section 2.1, section 2.2, etc. And then the list that appears under them, they go into more detail about that particular competency. So it might be that cataloging is snuck in under one of those, and I didn't pick up on it, but I do kind of feel like it might kind of should be a little more prominent, especially if you, like here at FSU, if you have a circulating technology program. In my experience, a lot of that stuff, maybe your access services team isn't cataloging books, but you're cataloging headphones, and you're cataloging laptops, you're cataloging course reserves. So that, that work is still being done in one way or another, and understanding all of that, how that functions, the best way to be making library records seems pretty important to an access services department. Good point, Eric. Thanks. Andrew's copied and pasted the text from the stack maintenance section there. Yeah, I don't see cataloging in that section.
There is a reference in long-term planning that working with colleagues is necessary, and that longer projects are unlikely to be the sole purview of access services, but it doesn't specifically call out cataloging.
A couple of comments in the chat from Nadine and Loftan and Maggie. Nadine says library shelving facilities could also be listed under collections and stack maintenance, offsite storage. And then Maggie comments, as an offsite storage person, I see the sense to that, but also our workflows and operations are different enough from general stack maintenance that I'm not sure it makes sense to be entirely grouped here. It's a good point, Maggie. And, like we said, a lot of access services departments are going to be structured differently. And I think what we're shooting for with the framework, with the authors, we're shooting for with the framework, is to capture as much as they could that spoke to the core. Here at FSU Libraries, we have an offsite storage facility. Hopefully we'll be getting a new one soon. Those live with access services. Those live with Eric Love. So he oversees all stacks storage for the general collection for FSU libraries at every location, period. Maggie, I see you also commented that you're high density. So Eric and I might reach out to you with a question or two in the future. And I guess one thing I want to do to maybe stir a little bit of conversation is focusing on that contextualizing question there. Are these competencies sufficient for hiring, training, or drafting position descriptions for a job in your department? And the Access Services Interest Group, when thinking about revising the document, one thing we're particularly interested in is trying to leverage it more as a tool for advocacy and for defining the labor of Access Services, to surface some of that invisible labor for administrators, the profession as a whole, etc. And so we're curious about the role this document could play in hiring and training, job posting, pay band, salary placement, etc. Lorelei, hand raised.
As a member of this committee, you would think I would have thought all these thoughts a long time ago, but it occurs to me right now in this minute, this is about, this would only be appropriate for hiring my position, head of Access Services. This does not help me really hire for my staff positions, except kind of, very like small bits of it, but like this broad thing. This isn't what my staff do. This is what I do. And it's just a little bit, it's so high level that it doesn't really help me in my day-to-day hiring of staff. That's what I want to say.
Yeah, Lorelei, that's a great point. And, one thing that has come up in our previous forums is the focus, the perceived focus of the framework on Access Services librarians. That it's a document that is catering to department heads, and that maybe it should broaden its scope more. But directly to your point, in my department, I would say not all of my staff members do all of these things, but all of them do some of these things. And I think about that when it comes to hiring a stacks person. Does the section in the competencies for collections and stacks management, does that section help me design a stacks manager job, right? Does the section on service help me design an Access Services manager job for my desk, or the job posting for even our part-time staff that are going to sit at the desk and answer the phones? Is there language there that I'm going to steal to put into my job posting or my position description when I write it? And that's the other kind of way I think about this competency section. When you're hiring niche people, can it still be giving you language? Comments in the section still about offsite storage. Pretty interesting convo. This comment about the last competency, spaces service. Yeah, I feel that same way too. I think it's kind of a confusing section. There's listed facilities maintenance, accessibility of space and resources, managing equipment and technology, and assessing spaces. I think here, we're talking about like study rooms. We're talking about reporting maintenance problems. I mean, every time the elevator breaks at Strozier Library, it's kind of assumed that the Access Services team is going to be the first to report it because we're the ones in the elevator all the time. But we're also tasked with opening the library post weather event. Here in Florida, we get hurricanes, and we're fortunate that the hurricanes tend to miss Tallahassee or maybe just like, graze us. And so typically a day or two after, even though the campus is closed, the access services team comes in, checks on spaces. Eric's job is to walk, all the floors and make sure there weren't any leaks and there weren't any damaged materials. And then if we're good, we open the circ desk, and we open as like a comfort station for students who didn't evacuate, who are still on campus. Maybe they don't have power. They can come here and charge their phones and hang out, use the internet if we have it. And so they're like preparing this, this space as a service. Eleanor Cleveland, who I think is in here, is our main access services manager. She does a lot of that work post-storm. We're really grateful to her and her efforts. Loftan.
Yeah, thanks. I just want to go back to your point about would this document be helpful? And the other co-conveners know this about me already, but I'll share with the rest of the folks here that I am relatively new to access services, not to librarianship, but so I've never used this document before. However, becoming more familiar with it over the past few months, I wish that I had access to it and that I knew of its existence, because I do think that it would have been really helpful just to show the wide range of areas that access services covers in a more, organized, official format. So I do think that I'll be using it in the future.
I agree, Loftan. I didn't have access to this document. I don't think it was actually published until 2020, I want to say. And so I was, 3-4 years into my career in access services at that point, and looking to make this step into a department head role somewhere. And I've also only ever worked at this library. And so having an understanding of what my department looks like compared to others, or what's the, ACRL, what is their standard? What is their expectation for what is in an access services department, who works there, what are the things that they do? That would have greatly helped me, especially when thinking about writing, presentation proposals, papers, that kind of stuff. Contextualizing that phrase a little more.
There's a really good comment in chat, Jeff.
Oh, thank you.
Yep, in section 1, billing is mentioned a few times, but there's no competencies in section 2 about taking payments, billing, appeals, debt collection, financial reporting, even setting up fine structures, that I don't see anything about money. And I mean, I have a register at my desk. I'm sure lots of you guys do too, unless you've managed to get someone else to collect the monies.
That is a fantastic point. Thank you for catching that, William. I think fines management lives in a lot of access services departments. We recently just absorbed it ourselves here at FSU. We're going through that process now. But I'm sure we also have other programs like community borrowers program, where you can, if you're not affiliated with the university, you can pay a small fee in order to have access, that kind of stuff. That's coming through access services. Replacement copies for damaged books or damaged technology, etc. And that's not in there. That's a really good point. And here at FSU, we don't take cash. There's no cash handling that's done inside the library. It's all, mediated through our, campus student management portal that they use. But it does have direct impacts on student experience. It puts blocks on their accounts. So if you have a library fine, you can't register for classes, can't apply for graduation, can't buy a parking pass, that kind of thing. I mean, it can have real serious impacts on their experience here. And then, the financial burden that students could potentially find themselves in when they break an $1,800 laptop. So, being able to thoughtfully negotiate those things from a financial perspective, I think is huge. And yeah, should be added. Good point. Yeah, printing cards. Yeah. Here, we're the only place where you can print on campus, and there is a fee associated. Yeah, Andrew points out, even if someone else is taking it, you're involved in the process for sure. Yeah, Lorelei says part of the hiring rubric for their front desk is cash handling experience. I will avoid going into an hour-long rant about the unfortunate overlap of retail and access services here, but noted. And can we just say access services librarian should have an MLS and an MBA? I might also add in a degree in social work to that list. Maybe public administration and nonprofit management. Chris raises a good point. I read into the statement managing core access services functions to encompass everything about fines, fees, the search system, etc. All of that could be detailed in a completely separate document. I think there's two interesting points being made there. One, the simple task of trying to write this document. There is so much that access services folk do to try and squeeze all of that into a framework that's actually helpful and concise. That alone is a Herculean effort, and I think they've done a really great job trying to give it some kind of shape, because it could go in 1,000 different directions. And then drilling down in both section 1, where they talk about the main chunks of traditional access services departments, and then here in section 2, what are the skills that those professionals need, that gives them the ability to add that extra detail. But I do think there are still some parts where it's a little too vague and a little too broad. And then, a phrase like managing core access services functions, that's kind of a broad phrase for a document of this nature that's trying to get more detailed. And so when I think about this document, this is something I've said time and time again in the forums, in our meetings with ASIG. I want this document to be a tool for advocacy for individuals who are in an access services role, who are applying for promotion, or you're asking for a raise. Something's been added to your PD, and you think that's pushing you outside the bounds of what it is that you're doing. This document, I want folks to be able to slide it across the desk of an administrator and say, this is what an access services librarian does. This is the expected level of service. So give me a raise or take that out of my job or whatever. And phrases like managing core access services functions. If I'm an administrator, that's the 5% other duties as assigned that I'm going to leverage as much as I can in order to, facilitate that job creep. That's going to help me out as a manager. And so looking for ways to weed that out of this document, I think is crucial. Being as specific as we can when possible. Ooh, lots going on in the chat. Okay. Andrew, you're in this conversation. You want to recap some of the messages that y'all have relayed?
Which conversation are we talking?
I see your comment here about technology informed.
Yes, Lorelei pointed out that systems work doesn't really seem to be called out a whole lot here, and especially those of us involved maybe in Ex Libris Alma knows that there's a lot of sysadmin work essentially that is being, in many cases, put onto access services folks because no one else is in charge of your fulfillment policies, essentially. But certainly it's not being presented in an easy to understand and user-friendly kind of way. So it involves a lot of the higher level admin work that you might expect from a web manager or something like that in the past, or your systems librarians. I mentioned that there is a tiny reference to it in the last bullet of 2.2.5 service in technology informed services that points out that Managers must stay abreast of technology trends and consider how to make full use of appropriate systems to strengthen and improve services. But that really doesn't get at the fact that it is not just staying up to date, but like this is an entirely configuration generally, and in many cases, discovery, because it is so tied to fulfillment, may actually also be managed by the same people in access services, which, does not have to be the case, was not always the case. But now that our ILSs and our OPECs are increasingly ubiquitously linked, it is really challenging to get out from behind either one of those, because they are so tied to the core services of access services, the core functions, that is. Your request form in Primo, for instance, is really tied to many of the decisions you make in configuration.
Yeah, that's a great point, Andrew, and yeah, not something I totally realized was not listed in the competencies here. I think there's also a connection there to the lack of mention of cataloging, right? Those two kind of go hand in hand. On in all the PDs that I write for supervisors and managers, I have a sentence in there that's like, builds and maintains an expert knowledge of all. And then I list out the platforms that we use here to, facilitate all of our various services. So I think, when we think about that as like terms of competency, right? Like, in the framework, we wouldn't want to say is really good at Alma, right? Because that's going to change. Different libraries going to use different things, etc. But yeah, that technical know-how, a familiarity with inventory management systems, how they function in libraries, and how access services departments leverage them is definitely a competency folks in the profession should have. And I just wanted to take a moment here to say my heart goes out to everyone who either recently did or is currently going through a migration, sending all the strength and power I can your way. It's just not fun. Lorelei makes a comment here about courier services. I want to say there was a mention of like campus delivery somewhere, but again, not focused on. And as we're listing stuff too, I want to the point we just made about the library management system. There's section 1 is does your department have this thing, and then section 2 is, are your managers good at these things? So I think there's a slight difference there, but an important one. In that, when I think about Lorelei's question, does it mention courier services? How would that appear in competencies for me? Well, it'd be logistics, right? You should have expert skills in managing logistics, how to develop policy, procedure, and workflow that create the greatest level of access for scholars with the least amount of work for staff, because that's the only way to build new services, sustainable services. But to your exact question, Lorelei, no, I don't think courier services are mentioned specifically in either. The list of things that should be in a department, and then the list of things we should be good at. Which for us, FSU Libraries, is huge. Our Library Express delivery service is one of the primary ways folks get books from us, delivering them all over campus. Andrew.
I was getting ready to type this out, but then I realized it's sort of too long to do that. So in 2.2.5 in service, it references the provision of specific services and ties them largely to the functionalities of access services, circulation, ILL reserves, etc. And then in the following bullet, customer service relations, to the psychological and emotional aspects of customer service. But what I don't see here, and I can't recall if I've noticed this before, but I definitely didn't call it out, so shame on me. There's not a lot of reference to what outside of the literal provision of a function is being provided in that customer service. Like when patrons come up to us asking, how do you own this thing? How do I find this thing? The educational aspect since I suspect in many, if not most of our cases, the goal isn't just to point them to the right resource. It's to teach them how to use the discovery tools and the overarching resources of the library, like how do I read LOC or Dewey if you use Dewey or whatever classification system you use. It's not just I'm going to go grab this off the shelf for you. There's an educational aspect that doesn't really seem to be covered here super well. And that being the education of the customer or patron or whatever you call the people who utilize your library. There's sort of that in the human resources and the leadership side with training and and employee engagement, but much less so in the how do I interact with patrons in a way that is consistent with my library's values.
Andrew, that was amazing. Thank you. Holy crap, you are so right. The sentence here, I just had it. Customer service / relations. For me personally, already a problem. I don't have customers at my library. I have scholars, I have students, I have staff, I have faculty. I don't have a single customer. As frontline service providers for a library, access services must develop proactive customer service internally and externally. I'm not entirely sure what that means. Then access services managers must also be skilled with conflict resolution as part of appeal or complaint processes. And so there, again, if we're going to get into this as like a document, there's only 2 sentences here, and one of them is negative. Not a great vibe. And Tori, I'm gonna call on you. That's rude, I know, but still, as an instruction librarian, and an access services librarian, I'm sure you have a key insight here. This is a place where that should go, right?
So there's just this like really wild idea, I think, and maybe it's kind of perpetuated by some people who think that different kinds of librarianship should be separate. But there's this wild idea that like people in access services don't do any sort of instruction, or that what Andrew described is, you just kind of point them to where they need to go and somehow they magically find the book. That's not the case ever, I don't think. I think a lot of libraries have now adopted the idea that we can't just hand students the resources that they ask for. We need to teach them how to find it and be good researchers. And that's what I've really tried to do, like with my student employees, is the training that I provide them is very much tied to the teaching that I do in information literacy sessions. I employ all of the same practices when I'm teaching students how to do research that I provide, like when I'm training my students. And I also very recently started to also teach them some basic reference answering skills, because sometimes students don't want to talk to me. I like to think that I'm pretty cool and I'm approachable, but sometimes students don't want to ask me for help, and they feel much more comfortable asking their friends at the desk for help instead. And even though they might be friends, my employee needs to be able to correctly teach them how to use the library and help them get the resources they need. So it's not just me doing instruction like on the instructional services librarian side, it's doing it on the training side, but also making sure that my students can provide that education as well. I think it's a really important part of access services. And I mean, the fact that like this is kind of mentioned as customer service in this framework, I don't think is a really accurate depiction of what we actually do. What we do, what our student employees do, there's a lot of teaching, whether or not it's like traditional teaching or not, that's what's happening. So I kind of got on a little soapbox there, but I'm really passionate about the relationship between instruction and access services, and how much of it we do in access services is actually a huge part of our job.
And I just want to bring everyone's attention to Chris Johnson's comment in chat. It is phenomenal, and I very much appreciate it. And it's basically saying, yeah, we do all the things. And look at us, we're awesome, which I really appreciate, Chris. Nicely done.
Chris, yeah, I dig it too. And Tori, you going on a soapbox is precisely why I called on you. So thank you. And I couldn't agree more. I think the word reference and the word information literacy not appearing in the competencies for a framework of any kind of librarianship, that's not okay. I think personally, one of my goals in critiquing the framework and hoping to improve it, make it better, is to make a more direct connection between access services and that larger intellectual craft of librarianship that we participate in. And at its core are reference and information instruction and information literacy. To Tori's point, we train the folks at the desk who then help everybody who walks in. The collections access crew that is going to bump into scholars while they're in the building on the floor. You're looking for a thing, here it is over here. Andrew mentions they don't even use the word triage, understanding where to send someone if you don't have the answer. That's a huge chunk of what an access services team does every day. Here at FSU Libraries, I'm fortunate that our instruction librarian also has some access services experience and offering frontline services. And when they developed an instruction team to kind of look at how instruction functions in the library, they reached out to Eleanor Cleveland, who's here in the chat, one of my access services managers, because of their training experience. You've trained an untold number of part-time staff. You've assisted an untold number of scholars in the library, helped the librarians develop, better instruction tools. I think it's crucial. I think it should definitely be added to the list of competencies, and it should go where we have the language of retail instead. There's some additional comments. Tori adds, it's also becoming more popular for an information desk to combine access services and reference. That's what we have here at FSU Libraries. We call it our scholar support desk. Yeah, so information literacy and access services are physically intertwined. Andrew notes, anybody have access services staff who don't get involved in online chat, email reference? Our full-time staff do a lot of that. If they're the point of contact for a particular service, or they helped someone in the past in person at the desk, here's my card. Hey, if you need any other questions, hit me up. They're more familiar with that person than maybe they are their subject librarian. And so they reach out to the access services staff. Eleanor Cleveland, again, she gets a lot of that just from facilitating our course reserve service. She helps faculty, and then they come back and I ask her about study rooms, and they ask her about this, they ask her about that. She becomes that point of contact. Then we do have a VR chat, and a lot of our staff sit on it. And fewer librarians. And then Lorelei adds, my former supervisor used to say that she wanted our desk to be the last stop before the right stop. It's pretty good. That's pretty good. I also think this focus on reference, it's become even more pronounced post-COVID. I know a lot of us were the only ones in the building, and maybe now you've been reopened for some time. As an access services team, you're probably working on site every day, but maybe your subject librarians aren't. And so there's still a lot of in-person reference that's happening at the desk. That increased since COVID. And then the referral to the subject librarian, it's not as immediate. It's here's their email, contact them later. And we're doing more and more of that in person at the desk. Any other glaring omissions from the competencies? We found some pretty good ones. Fines and billing. I think that's clutch. Reference, information literacy, instruction. Those are huge. I would make an argument here. I've talked with Lorelei about this some, and Eleanor on my team, for collection development. I think course reserves is collection development. I think if you have a circulating technology program where you're checking out headphones and cameras and projectors, I think that's collection development. I think access services staff often serve on like pop lit. You might have a pop lit collection at your academic library. 9 times out of 10, those are run by staff, not subject librarians. That's collection development. Study rooms, considering the usage of study rooms, changing your study rooms. Hey, we're getting asked for more and more group rooms. These 4-hour individual rooms, maybe that should go to 8. That's a collection of things. You're changing how they function. That's collection development, in my opinion. And I think it's something that access services folk do a lot more than they appreciate. Lorelei is now using the forum to crowdsource general access services questions, which I cannot begrudge her for.
Yes, I'm sorry. I realized this is not the forum for this. And then I was like,
No,
wait,
it's totally fine. We're in the
question.
room. Ask the question.
because I don't have any individual study rooms that have ceilings, so they're open because of HVAC concerns, of course. And so anyway, so sorry guys. I just, yeah, anyway, if you just want to say it in chat, don't take
a Zoom room is better than a listserv. I understand. I'll say quickly, at FSU libraries, we discourage folks from taking tests in our building because it's not great for that proctored exam software. It's not going to be quiet enough. Someone's going to walk behind you. It's going to get flagged. The Wi-Fi is going to drop. I don't want any of that on my conscience that you got kicked out of your exam. I think we're going till 3, right? So we got 10 minutes left. Any other glaring omissions, details that need to be added, language that should be tweaked, thoughts on using the competencies when writing PDs or reviewing candidates for a job or incorporating them into your training? I'll say that when surveyed holistically, oh, here's Loftan. Resource sharing is missing from section 2, right? So there's a brief mention of ILL under managing core access services functions. And ILL, interlibrary loan as a whole, appears as part of section 1, like what your library should have. But I will say when it discusses ILL, again, thinking about it as a competency and not just like a thing you should have, it just briefly mentions that you should have experience managing core access services functions. But to your point, resource sharing is a different beast. And understanding relationships between universities, how those, like we have reciprocal borrowing agreements, that kind of stuff, how all that functions is very different than just saying, yeah, you should know something about ILL. I think resource sharing would be as deserving as a section as collections and stack maintenance, and be given that breakdown level of detail under competencies, in my opinion. I will point out, like, with our comments about reference and instruction and information literacy and collection development, all kind of missing from this list of competencies. We have stuff that others don't, and I think that is kind of telling about how the labor is perceived. How many other frameworks for librarianship have safety and security, have human resources, And I'd want to challenge that moving forward. Is that all access services does? Is that how we're perceived? That, you know, we're just in the furnace shoveling coal to keep the library running. It's a crucial part of what we do, but if you look at this list of competencies, it's the overwhelming majority of what we do. And even that labor, I think, can be recontextualized. Tori?
Yeah, so as you can probably imagine, I also have very strong feelings on the safety and security portion. So I think we have to be really careful about how we phrase safety and security. One, because although it might be unfortunately true that as an access services person, you're kind of the default security person, regardless, we are not security companies. Like, we're not security guards. And so the language in our documents should never reflect that, as far as I'm concerned. There's also a lot of very negative associations with security, especially for certain populations who are in our libraries. And so when we're talking about safety and security in our buildings, I think we really need to be mindful of that and make sure that when we are trying to make sure the building is safe for everyone to use, that we are not consciously or unconsciously targeting especially students who have never had a great experience with security. And I think that's the real danger of making this such a core part of access services, is that I think it potentially has the unintended consequence of making us feel like we need to be security guards, which I don't think any of us really want. But also we may act in that way unconsciously, and then even though our intent is to make the library a safe and wonderful place for everyone to use, we may be actually working against ourselves, depending on how we handle this. So I think there needs to be some language about equity and inclusivity, especially within safety and security. I mean, within the entire document, I think that needs to be added, but especially with safety and security, considering the kind of political state that the United States has been in for a very long time.
Tori, I could not have said any of that better. I'm just gonna yes and you in that. In addition to everything Tori said, if you look at the sections under safety and security, composure, conflict management, response, contingency planning, if you look at the sentences that follow each of those, there's no reason those can't go elsewhere within the framework. The language that's used to describe composure easily fits under leadership, or in my opinion, service management. The language for conflict management, again, easily goes under service or under leadership. It also doesn't mention, the conflict management among coworkers, your staff as a manager. So that could go under HR if we think an HR section should stay. And then response and contingency, that can go under, collection stacks management or space as a service, facilities management. Whenever, Stroger's had a flood and I wasn't here the Christmas night when it happened, Eric Love was here wading through floodwaters and saving books. He's our collections and stacks manager. So I think that stuff, it belongs, but not where it is and not in this very particular context. And there's a lot of language I find in the competencies that just assume you're going to get yelled at and prepare for it. And I think Yeah, maybe a little less of that. The last thing I'll say is some of the language under composure and conflict management, they're also just describing the reference interview. Like that can happen in a reference interview, that the student is stressed out because they're waiting till the last minute to do their exam, or something has happened in their personal life. Every time you interact with a scholar, you have to do those things, not just when something has gone bad or awry in the library. 3 minutes left. I'm going to stop talking. Any final comments, thoughts, questions? Let's hear them. Yes, it is being recorded. Thank you for that. I also want to mention the other sessions were also recorded. So you can watch those on the ACRL YouTube if you want to see the whole conversation so far. Ariana, that is the plight of all access services, information professionals, actually finding the time to attend something like this. So with 3 minutes left, I just want to thank everyone for finding that time and for joining us here today and having this conversation. We look forward to having more. We hope to see some folks, ALA in the future, ACRL coming up in the future, where we hope to be in person and having these roundtable discussions with all of y'all as we continue thinking and prodding and problematizing the access services framework. Andrew, thank you for organizing us today. Tori, Loftan, Lorelei, Christine, thanks for all your hard work on the interest group, making these forums possible. And thanks for a great session, everybody. Woohoo!
Yes, and
Well done.
and hopefully the rest of you have a